Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our placemaking conference. I am Maya Kyle, the Director for the Division of Interior Design here at OU, and it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session, Marcus Westbury and Patrick Kennedy. Marcus Westbury is the founder of multi-award-winning Renew Newcastle and Renew Australia projects that have helped launch more than 200 creative and community projects in Newcastle, New South Wales, and reopen more than 100 vacant properties across Australia. He also is an urbanist, a writer, media maker, and festival director, and is the founder and manager of multiple arts events, community projects, and social enterprises across Australia. Last year, Mr. Westbury became inaugural CEO of Social Enterprise Contemporary Arts Precincts, which is leading the development of the Collingwood Arts Precinct in Melbourne. He advises government and businesses and speaks and writes extensively in Australia and internationally about creativity, culture, and place. Mr. Westbury will speak about Renew Australia.
Thank you very much. Is my mic on? Can I do this? Yes? Okay, good. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background, tell you a little bit about the place I come from, which is a town called Newcastle in Australia. I'm assuming that most people here have never been to Newcastle, Australia. Has anyone been to Newcastle, Australia? What? Was there one? Fantastic. Yay! I prepared this fantastic video.
Industrial City. Newcastle is one of the major industrial centres of Australia. 100 miles north of Sydney at the mouth of the Hunter River, it's one of the busiest ports in the country. Its harbour handles over 2,000 ships a year. Many of the city's population of some 200,000 work in its great industries. Newcastle ships wool, wheat, steel, chemicals, rayon, glass, coal and consumer goods to the world. Newcastle Steel makes machines and ships built in the harbour's own dockyards. This is the story of any day in Newcastle, Industrial City.
Now, I don't know how much you know about the Australian economy, but that was made in 1959. That is pretty much a list of everything Australia doesn't make anymore. Coal, we still do coal, but steel, ships, manufactured goods. Newcastle is pretty much a fairly classic sort of Rust Belt town situation. A friend of mine said to tell Americans, it's kind of like Toledo if it had about 20 miles of Pacific coast next to it. So if that gives you any reference, you understand the sort of place we're talking about. The biggest employer in Newcastle used to be the BHP Steelworks, and that's a shot of it in its heyday. At one point, it employed 20,000 people in a city of about 200,000 people. So literally 10% of the population worked in one big steel factory. And then this happened. Over the course of the 40 or so years between these two films, the steelworks gradually, it shrunk further and further and further till it eventually closed down in 1999. And so I grew up in Newcastle in the 80s and the 90s, and it was really growing up in a city that was in a constant state of decline. It was always going backwards. And a very palpable sense of a place where the future had been ripped out from under it. I'm not an architect. I'm not an urban planner. I don't belong here. I have no credibility whatsoever to speak in front of this audience. I am one of Fred's zealous nuts or crazy lunatics or whatever it was I was supposed to be. The backstory to this project is that I used to do arts festivals and events, and I came back to Newcastle after living in Melbourne for a few years in 2008 and walked up and down the two main streets of my hometown and looked at them again for the first time in 5 years. And this is what I saw. Boarded up buildings, for lease signs, boarded up, smashed in. You get the idea. The main street's about a mile long. And I counted at the time 150 empty buildings in the two main streets, or visibly empty buildings in the two main streets. Like beautiful buildings. So this is Newcastle's post office. It's one of the really great, iconic buildings in the city, and it's been derelict for 20 years now. But you know, on a more basic level, just every second shop, all these buildings were empty. Later, I came back and did a fancy Google map of it, and mapped all these little red dots, which were the vacant buildings in the city at the time. So, look, Newcastle, for a long time there, I think the biggest industry in Newcastle was architects' impressions of what it was going to be eventually. Newcastle hasn't suffered for lack of plans, you know. There has been plans. I don't have the other photo, but there was two schemes for Newcastle that were done 5 years apart, and they both featured an artist's impression of exactly this spot on the street. And the buildings changed and the plans and the things behind it, but it must have been the same person that illustrated it because they used the same car in the foreground in both pictures. This is the latest version. It's going to look like that apparently, and then there's, you know, colour-coded one. As you can see, some of your planners have had a bad rap this morning, I suspect, from a few different contexts. But look, to zoom out, there's not necessarily anything wrong with these plans. The problem is not the content. You know, the things that these plans suggest, for the most part, are really good things to do, and they make a lot of sense. But the context is always one that's very disempowering. It's always one that involves looking from the top down. I've got a running joke that the revitalisation of Newcastle is 2 to 5 years away, and it always has been. Like, it's always something that's going to happen, but there's always a really good reason why it's not happening now. And I think part of the danger of this sort of approach is that waiting is disruptive. You know, that just the act of waiting for the plan to happen sometimes means people sit on property, leave it vacant. They're waiting for the thing to happen that's going to grow the value and fix everything, and then they'll do something. And so often I find that these kind of processes can be very disempowering for local communities. Now, as I said, my background, I'm not a festival person, I'm not an architect. I used to do arts festivals and events. I've done a bit of media work and TV and radio and other things, write a bit in Australia. One of the things that has always interested me has been the other side of this, some of this sort of disruptive globalisation. Now, people may not be aware of this, but Australia in the 2000s went through a massive mining boom, and basically off the back of sending iron ore and coal and other things up to China. This is actual employment data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. No one noticed that we had a jewellery making boom. And in the course of 6 years, there was a 671% increase in the number of people making a living professionally or semi-professionally making jewellery in Australia. At the same time that coal grew 70, whatever it is, %. And so what you're seeing is the flip side of the way technology is changing what is possible in local communities. So increasingly, the sort of manufacturing that used to be done in Newcastle is being done in places like China. It's being moved offshore. The bigger industries are becoming more and more centralised. The flip side of that is that there's this explosion. This is the Australian version. This is not statistically correct at all. I just put dots randomly on a map of Australia. Of people working from their bedrooms, sunrooms, spare rooms, garages, making things, selling them online, taking advantage of technology to connect to global audiences. And now you can now literally have the effect of people who can make things in a place like Newcastle and sell it to New York, or from Melbourne and sell it to Mumbai, or Sydney and sell it to Shanghai. And so I was very interested in trying to combine these two forces. I look at all these vacant spaces. Oh yes, sorry, it's the other stats. Is everyone familiar with Etsy? I just use it because it's just a nice measure, and I just happen to screenshot every 2 years or so the number of people making stuff. So this is, I don't know if anyone knows this, but you can search locally in Etsy just for things made in your local area. And this is a search from around the time we started Renew Newcastle. And there were 700 items being made individually and being sold from Newcastle. I came back probably 2-3 years later, and that number had tripled to 2,100 items. Came back again, another couple of years later, and that number had tripled again to nearly 6,500 items. And, you know, the other thing that Etsy does, which cities do very badly, is they actually try to seduce you into being a creator. You know, it's actually very hard to just buy stuff on Etsy. It's almost like it's trying to, like, you know, on every page there's a button that says open a store here, which sadly our main streets are lacking. Interesting statistic, you probably won't get this here, but in Australia, 70% of Australian Etsy sales are international exports. So that means there's people running businesses from their sunrooms, spare rooms, bedrooms, garages, or wherever it is that they make their stuff. And they're selling it to markets all around the world. And Etsy is just one of, you know, dozens of ways, from iTunes to Amazon, that you can find a global market if what you're doing is sufficiently interesting. Not just Etsy, but there's also the rise of 3D printing, there's the rise of sort of small-scale maker and manufacturing technology, and this actually sits quite comfortably in the context of a city that has a long history of making and creating and craftsmanship. The question that was of interest to me and the experiment that we wanted to run is whether you could use this phenomenon as a driver of local economic renewal. So in 2008 we decided to see what would happen if we did. But my basic theory was that every single one of those empty spaces in the main streets of Newcastle was a lost opportunity. Every day a shop sat empty was a lost chance to do something, start something, try something, test something. Even if none of it worked, the very act of trying that stuff would make the city a more interesting place. I'm also a really big believer in the idea that initiative and experimentation, and not just capital, are keys to revitalisation. So it's not just about picking big winners and planting them down. You know, the city was full of stories about what the $100 million, $200 million, $500 million investment is that's going to change the city. My question was, well, what about the people that have $100, $500, $1,000 and want to test an idea and start a business? So we set up a not-for-profit company called Renew Newcastle. Had a board that came from a wide range of backgrounds in the local community. It was seed funded using a very complicated financing structure. And basically what we did was we set up a scheme that does something very simple. We went to the owners of those empty properties and said, look, can we borrow them while you're not using them? We'll borrow them on a rolling 30-day basis. We'll lend them to someone who wants to do something, start something, try something. If you get a better offer, you can have the building back. Otherwise, we'll keep it in good condition, clean it up, fix it up, reopen it. A lot of questions we asked ourselves. We managed things like insurance for all of the projects. We tried to look at all the things we could make easy, and we tried to hack all the loopholes and exemptions and permits and other things around which we could basically get things in quickly and get them happening quickly. I'll skip that because I know I'm very tight for time, but I want to show you what happened. This had once been the main street of Newcastle. This is sort of, when I was a kid, my grandmother would dress up to go shopping in town. It was like a big deal. By 2008, it looked like this. You can see empty, empty, empty. That guy was there, but apart from that, there's a pole dancing. You can see Polarised, the pole dancing studio, that little sign there. Apart from that, it was empty. And this is us signing our very first ever agreement. It's Marnie Jackson, who's worked with me on Renew Newcastle in the early days, signing our first ever agreement to borrow the first of those properties. And we literally began going shop by shop, building by building, place by place, cleaning them up, fixing them up, reopening and putting community projects and businesses and other things into those spaces. I don't have time to go through all of these, but everything from contemporary art spaces, that's a sound art gallery. And if anyone knows what a sound art gallery is, you get bonus points. This is a collective of local makers. They did that fit out on $60 and hard rubbish day. They just collected a bunch of stuff they found by the side of the road. Everything in that picture, they either made it themselves or they found it. They couldn't afford paint, so they got the ends of all the white paint tins their friends had in their garages and mixed them up in a big bucket. It's a unique shade of white. You'll not see that white anywhere else in the world. This is an old ophthalmologist surgery, which we converted into studios for little startup businesses like laptop-based design businesses, little incubators for creative businesses like that. And then this is where that guy was sitting by himself. This is about 6 months later. Starting to have shops open, starting to have spaces come available, fashion designers. These guys were running a record label from their bedroom. Artisans, craftspeople, architects. These boys, the youngest was 17 and the oldest was 21, and they designed t-shirts and skateboards. And they said, we'd like to have a store to sell our t-shirts and skateboards. And I sort of put it in the category of that'll be a good learning experience. And I was completely wrong, because 6 years later they've got a full commercial lease and they now sell their t-shirts and skateboards across the country and around the world. This is a co-working space, 28 separate businesses operating out of there. It, in and of itself, has spun out dozens of successful small businesses in the city. I won't go through all of these, but you can see the various events. Jewellers, this lady's a photographer, designer. This is an old department store. I could tell you the story about it, but it'd take too long. Essentially, we took this whole city block department store in the centre of town, and it is in and of itself too big to take over, but we wanted to bring the windows and reopen them. So we built basically a theatre prop petition to stop people from getting in. It's a heritage listed building. You technically cannot touch the building. So by putting everything on like sandbag things behind it, we were able to put things in the window bays and introduce little artisanal and craft businesses into this city block building that had been empty. So this is Newcastle today. This is the same street. These are the other businesses that have moved into the area, the places that have opened. That's the department store building. And this is what's changed. All of those red dots were empty buildings when the project began. The green ones are properties that we've reopened, that we've cleaned up, we've fixed up, and are now commercially tenanted, often by the projects that we helped put in there. That was the before. The orange ones are the ones we currently had under management at the time, and there's still a few red ones here and there, but it's made a huge, huge difference to the city. Just some stats. Where as of the end of last year, we'd done 236 projects. The red line is how many projects we had running at any given time, and the blue line is how many new projects we opened each year. And as you can see, it's been growing steadily and slowly over those last few years. I probably don't have time to go through all this, but the mixture of things that we've been involved in. This is my favourite statistic for those of you that are just really interested in the bottom line. This is crime data, vandalism of commercial property. So I don't know if you can read the figures, but basically since we began, which is the left of that graph, to 2014, which is the right of the graph, the vandalism of commercial property in Newcastle dropped by 25.6% per year, every year. All up, we've done 250 projects. 81 properties have been reopened. There's a 60 to 90% drop of vacancy rate in the city. 500,000 tourists a year visit the city. The mall, that empty shopping mall, it's made sort of straight Main Street mall I showed you before, is the second most popular tourist attraction in Newcastle now, behind only the beaches. Two of our projects have gone on to buy buildings, and about a third of our projects have gone on to become viable, sustainable and ongoing businesses in the city. The University of Newcastle just did a study and found that the project has, I always get this back to front, benefit-cost ratio of 14.4. Every dollar spent on the project comes back nearly 15-fold in those sorts of spin-off benefits in the city. One of the other great benefits has been the new narrative that's been created for the city. Lonely Planet randomly named Newcastle one of the top 10 cities to visit in the world. Keeps featuring in tourist magazines. This is an in-flight magazine listing the bohemian capitals of the world. You know, the usuals. Paris, New York, Mexico, Bangkok, Newcastle. Story from the New Republic. This is Australia's coolest coastal town right now, apparently. National Geographic. And then stories about some of the businesses that we've started. One of our very first projects recently sold for $11.6 million. It's a startup media company. The model that we pioneered with Renew Newcastle is one that's spread around Australia now. So now these are from country towns. That town called Cooma in New South Wales, town of 20,000 people. That's their first 3D printing studio and an empty shop on the main street. These are projects from Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide. It's a story from the local press in Adelaide about a part of town that's been brought back to life using the model that we developed with Renew Australia. And Renew Australia has now just finished, it's just clocked over 100 communities that it's been working with nationally around the country. I just want to finish on some thoughts that will hopefully be useful to this crowd. The work of Renew is not about pop-ups or making things cool or about a buzz or a vibe or any of those things. It's about lowering the barriers to entry so lots of people can try lots of things. It's really thinking a lot about how cities work at the small scale for people who don't have capital, doesn't have a lot of resources, and finding clever ways around allowing people to do small things without complicated overheads, be they capital or compliance or all the other things that make it difficult for people to try stuff. And I think a lot of cities are failing at the small scale without even realising it. Importantly, Renew is not a project about attracting people from outside. It's a project that actually finds ideas that people in the Newcastle community has and helps them grow them. It's a means of unleashing the sweat equity of the people in the local community to literally go block by block, street by street, shop by shop, and fix up and clean up their own city. And there's an immense amount of pride that comes with that. It's not about trying to attract big industries or spending a lot of capital. It's about how do you make places function for small things that don't have lots of capital? And how do you create dynamics that initiative is attracted to and in which small things can grow? Some rules I've learned along the way. Don't professionalise participation. There's too many experts. There's too much difficulty. Ask people what they want to do. Very weird question, but apparently lots of people have ideas for things they want to do and they're not doing them for random reasons. I have to now admit I don't know what works. I think it's very important you design places to adapt. You plan and think at the scale of sweat and not at the scale of capital. You learn by doing and you make failing cheap. Great places come from an organic experiments. A city is something we make by our actions, and we discover what works by doing it. So Renew has been a project about rolling up our sleeves and doing it. I'm just going to give you a free, it's not a free plug, it's actually a free offer. I wrote a book, not distributed widely in this country. If you write down that URL and use the very secret code OKC as the password, you can download a free ebook which tells the story in much more detail than I've had time to today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Next, we have Patrick Kennedy. Patrick is a planner and urban designer with more than 15 years' experience tackling complex urban challenges at a local, national, and international scale. He is a co-founder of A New Dallas, a nonprofit promoting transportation alternatives and neighborhood revitalization. His focus is on the interrelationship between movement, infrastructure, network design, and real estate market dynamics in order to deliver successful, lovable, sustainable places. He has recently been appointed to the board of directors of the Dallas Area Rapid Transit. Mr. Kennedy's talk is A New Dallas. Please welcome Mr. Patrick Kennedy.
Sure. Ready to go? Yes, I am from Texas. I come in peace. I did not go to UT, though, so thank you for welcoming me. It's been super exciting to be part of all these speakers. I'm more excited to actually listen to all the great speakers that are here. It's super exciting to share a stage with Marcus Westbury. I was joking with him last night that he was one of the first people I ever followed in Twitter back in 2009, and that both he and Greg Lindsay, I've shared stages with them in the past month. So it's great to actually meet somebody when you feel like you know them over social media, but now that you meet them in person. So you've welcomed me here to Oklahoma. I want to welcome you to A New Dallas. And this is a Dallas that does not yet exist, but it exists more so in the minds of all of us that are joining this organization. And it's an organization about focusing on the future of Dallas and defining that future and being participatory and helping to change that in a way that they want to see that works for them. And to get this started, I like to play a little game. I started this on my blog 10 years ago, where I would invite the winner out and have a beer with them. They had to guess the city right. And really the point of this is to get people thinking about the dynamism of cities and how much they change. We interact with them on a day-to-day basis, and they seem the same, But really, they change on a different timeline. They evolve. Every city we know has evolved, and the point of that is that we have agency in making those changes. Now that's hard to tell. We're floating over it. It's sundown. Let me drop down into the space. You might get some hints. We got some German companies, Teutonic architecture. We're starting to drill down on what it is. Any ideas? It's actually Dresden, and this is Dresden in 1945, and I'm cribbing from James Howard Kunstler. If you ever read him, he talks about this idea. Where was the war actually fought, right? Because we see, if this is Dresden now, this was Dallas around a similar time, and I cribbed this. I did a screen grab from a 1939 Kodachrome video that we found on eBay, and it showed Dallas like this, and it was curious because we're always thinking Dallas, that's a city built for the car. Well, it turns out it wasn't built for the car. It was built by rail crossroads, which we actually bribed to not go through Waco and instead go through Dallas back in the 1880s, and now we're the big city. And it was built for streetcars, which interconnected all the neighborhoods, but most importantly, it was built for the pedestrian. Now, this was a time when we were rounding 400,000 people and headed to 500,000 people, so Dallas was not an insignificant place at the time. But this is Dallas now, and this is less than a mile away from where that scene was. So within a mile, we've got a range of real estate values from $400 a foot to maybe $1 a foot if we're lucky. And the point of this is to show that cities change fast and slow. Bombs going off, obviously, is going to change a city fast. But also our policies, our infrastructure design and funding also can set the stage for the future of a place. I like to joke that sort of cribbing from Winston Churchill, that the market is always right after it's been wrong. We build a highway and then we say, let's invest along that highway, and then we watch it slowly decay over time. Because it's not a place built to sustain investment. Now, my story and this story of a new Dallas really starts with me moving to Texas in the first part of this century. And I was lucky enough to get a job, and when I was looking for warm weather and sprawling city where I could maybe make a little bit of a difference. Turns out sprawl and warm weather tends to align, lucky for me. But I was able to get a job working in the first couple phases of some projects called Addison Circle and Legacy Town Center. And this is Legacy Town Center, and this was the original plan for it. And now it's fully built out, 200 acres, and has actually jumped that highway to a project called Legacy West. And Legacy West is the old JCPenney campus where Toyota is now moving their corporate headquarters into a mixed-use community. The funny thing about this is when these were being designed and built, multifamily and mixed use, those were words that were verboten. We couldn't actually talk about that because nobody actually wanted it until they saw it. And they said, well, we want that too. And now every single municipality in DFW area is like, we want that too. But this was my walk to work every day. I lived in Deep Ellum area and walked to downtown. And funny thing is, this picture was taken on Google Street View 2 months ago. But my walk was 15 years ago and it hasn't changed at all. These were multi-billion-dollar projects that are happening in the northern suburbs. And every day I would walk under this highway. Why is that not happening here? Nothing has changed, even though there's probably the same cars stuck in the same traffic jam on that highway. But I'd walk past boarded up buildings, surface parking lots, vacant land, and just wonder, why is this way? Why can't it be something else? And then, light bulb went off, and I realized that this is highest and best use. And that's what we've created, right? The market's response to this is that we don't want to be there. We don't want to be next to that highway. So we're going to take our investment elsewhere, where it's cheaper land. Then I started to ask, what used to be there? And I started researching it and realized that a lot of us know Deep Ellum. A lot of us have been to Dallas before, right, in this sort of entertainment area. Well, Deep Ellum used to be bigger, and it used to blend into downtown. And what the highway did was actually take out half of it. It wiped out a Freedmanstown, as well as the Harlem Theater. This was really the sort of the crucible of innovation. The Harlem Theater was where Lead Belly and Blind Lemon Jefferson and Robert Johnson would play, right? Dallas used to be the epicenter of Texas jazz and blues culture. We were actually an exporter of culture. What's the culture of Dallas right now? I don't know, money, cowboys? But now we're an importer of that, and there's some economic value to actually, creating innovation and selling culture to the rest of the world. And we've created this notion now that everything has to be world class, and so we build arts districts and performing arts facilities, this sort of monumental architecture. Yet we've got no way to actually maintain it, right? We don't have the tax base to support all of this. all this high-end design, and we've created this notion of the shining city on the hill. But the reality was very different. But the less cynic in me realized that this is a city of great ambition and great capital, but actually had no way to actually achieve what is really world-class. And to me, world-class cities are those places that are fountains of creativity and innovation. And to do that, we actually have to intermix the people. People have to meet and greet and interact with each other. And that's really where we are today, that we've been investing in this idea of a city, this notion of a city, the Potemkin village of a city, but not really the function and well-being of a city. We haven't gotten sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We haven't gotten the baseline right. We have to be investing in the baseline of how do we lift everybody else up. And this ultimately is where, this is 345, this is the highway that I'm going to be talking about, is literally falling down. And so as part of it, I started researching, okay, 2009 recession came along, people thought I was crazy, I quit my job to start my own firm. During a recession, starting my own company, I had a lot of downtime, so I started researching highways and the impact of highways on real estate values. And it's easy to understand how nobody would cross that, right? Nobody's going to play Frogger and try to get across that street. But what is perhaps more pernicious is the barrier of distance, not crossing the highway, but what it does to real estate market dynamics, that it stretches out. It stretches everything out, and so distance becomes the primary barrier to the local economy and accessing the economy. Also induces car dependence, and that's another barrier, just the cost of maintaining a car in order to make a paycheck. And while it creates value at the edge, it's largely lower value, but it actually depresses value because high-density areas of downtowns need abundant access, yet we're building limited access freeways along them. And so it's that juxtaposition that's created the negative downward pressure on our real estate in downtown. And so I also hear, well, highways, that creates growth. It's like, okay, well, let's look into that a little bit. This is a density map of Dallas and Fort Worth in 1950. The two cities combined were approaching 1 million people. It had been growing at nearly 300% over that time. So, okay, let's compare that to 2010, 30-year span, again, after we built all the highways, before we built the highways and after we built all the highways. Turns out we actually were growing at a slower rate, still growing, but we were actually growing at a faster rate before air conditioning, before highways. And so that growth was still happening, but it was happening in a more sustainable, more accessible way. And instead, we've just grown out, and we haven't grown up, and we haven't grown up in the way that we're increasing tax base to maintain all of that infrastructure that we've built. And we're just now starting to come up on those price tags. And the response to that is that our trips are very long, right? 12.2 miles is the average length to get to work in Dallas. We're second in the country in terms of length. That's a barrier itself. You take that 12.2 miles and draw a map and draw an arrow from that, it is actually outside the entire municipality or municipal boundaries of the city of Dallas. We're effectively subsidizing people to take their property taxes out of the city, live outside, commute in, to essentially take advantage of the city. And we get stuck with the bill. The market responds to that. And the market responded by actually building 83% of household starts. We're growing at 150,000 people per year in the Metroplex. But if 83% of those starts are out and never built before greenfield, that is a lot of infrastructure that we're building at a low tax base. So what's going to happen when that bill comes due? Now, this is really the tragedy of Dallas. We were building the most supply, the biggest buildings between the 1950s and the 1980s, all those skyscrapers. Haven't built anything taller since the 80s. At the same time, we were sapping demand. We were depressing the value of the land and sending it outwards. The vision was everybody gets in their car, gets on the highway, drives to a parking garage, interconnects with their building with tunnels that go underneath downtown, and that was the vision. And, I think we have to reverse that division, or reverse that inertia. And to do that, I felt like we had to ask a more fundamental question. What is the purpose of cities? And instead of this sort of supply side approach of just supplying things, of building things, how do we actually drive demand so people want to be there? And so the market sort of takes control. We're sort of lighting a fire, not filling a bucket. So I ask you, anybody have any guesses? What is the purpose of a city? Anybody? Exchange of ideas, that's a good one, but wrong. It's congestion relief. At least if you operate in this space, everybody, that's the one thing that trumps all other questions. We have to alleviate congestion, right? But okay, let's play that game for a second. Well, what does congestion really mean? Well, it's the triple convergence of mode. DFW is the most car-dependent metro in the entire US. Time, because we're all commuting long distances, we're all on the road at the exact same time. And space. And the funny thing is about highways is that no matter how big we make them, they can't scale with demand, right? Demand rises and falls at different times during the day, but we can't expand highways, during that. Yet it's all one fixed cost that we put into it. Meanwhile, you take rail, bus, you just drop another train on there and you've doubled capacity. And it's sort of easy rhetorically to say, well, congestion is terrible, therefore we have to spend money on that, because everybody is frustrated, stuck in traffic, right? So that's an easy sell. Well, let's look into the Texas Transportation Institute's rankings, and I saw, okay, well, let's see where DFW lies. Well, we're right next to Detroit. Okay, some red flags are starting to show up. Let's look deeper into that. So maybe we should ask the question, is congestion really good or bad? And is it the thing that we have to basically treat with nerve gas and get rid of entirely? So let's ask the question, what about congestion costs as a percentage of income? Well, it turns out that it's the wealthiest cities that are the most congestion, and maybe congestion is actually economic activity, and we're trying to get rid of that. So maybe is that not such a great idea? And lastly, when you look at what is the cost to actually get around, it turns out that the poorest cities are spending the most amount to actually participate in that local economy. And so it's really that maybe the answer is that wealth comes from efficient trips, more cost efficient, more energy efficient, and that commonwealth is actually boosted by choice. You don't have to own a car to participate in the local economy. So TTI, every year they do their congestion report, and they, the headline every time is congestion costs the country $120 billion per year, which that seems like a big number, right? But we're also a big economy. You actually factor that out per capita, that's $400 per person. That's kind of like the price of just doing business. On the other hand, car dependence, nearly $7,000 per person, $2 trillion per year, and that is just waste, just getting around, making the same kind of trips that we could be making in other ways had we been investing on the public infrastructure side in a different way. So I started looking into the idea and the data TTI put together, and people say, well, we just need bigger highways because then we can less traffic and all that. Well, if we actually charted, like I did here, the freeway lane miles per capita, highway capacity of all 250 metros in the country, compare that to how much people drive. Turns out all we're doing by building bigger highways is just making people drive more. Same idea. Everything is just stretching out, getting further and further apart, disaggregating communities. Now let's compare that highway lane miles capacity to average per capita to average commute time. Well, there's this tension that exists, right? People don't want to be too close to work. They don't want to be too far away. They still need time to decompress. National surveys suggest about 22 minutes is ideal, and every city actually exists between this 22-minute commute and the higher income cities like New York and the Bay Area, where we're willing to tolerate a little bit longer commutes in terms of time. But every city actually ends up falling within that span. So we started to ask this question, okay, which kind of city do we want to be? I put Vancouver and Detroit up here because these are two cities in North America that have actually solved congestion. The congestion is actually getting better. One did it by adding 1 million people, and one did it by losing 1 million people. And it comes down to formula. I mean, Detroit did it no different than we have in Dallas. We're just lucky because we're a little bit younger. But the formula that goes into it is that, well, we've got a highway going through the countryside. It doesn't need to be that big, but as it approaches the city, it has to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because of all the land uses in the area. Well, what happens if you end up displacing all of those land uses? What happens if they say, well, now you just unlocked cheaper land, I'm going to move out further? What happens if you made my access worse? Now, the Vancouver model, on the other hand, when they said, you know what, no thanks, we're not going to allow cities or highways into our city. Same highway going through the rural countryside approaching the city. As it crosses the boundary, it scales down to a boulevard. The shops and whatnot organized along that boulevard. Walking and biking actually works because you connect to where you're trying to go. And as it hits the city, it disappears entirely into the grid. And that grid actually has more capacity for cars than the highways would have anyway. But that density in the core also allows transit to work. And so we're actually diluting congestion by getting people out of cars, by letting them get around at different times of day. and the economy actually ends up working better. And that's when we have to define success. What do we actually really want? Should this be defined entirely by the engineer's ideal of a street? The best highway is when nobody else is on the road because they're your enemy. They're in your way. They could kill you. But the economist level of service is, a lot of people on the street, a lot of economic activity, low infrastructure basis, high tax base. That actually sustains itself. That produces enough tax base to sustain the infrastructure and produce amenity. And if you want, actually lower taxes. So to me, I would suggest the exchange of ideas along these lines. The purpose of cities is social and economic exchange. It's because cities are fundamentally the physical form of economies. They're the market for all things that make us human, the exchange of ideas, of goods, of services, of laughs, of love. But to be that platform for exchange, of innovation, we actually have to compress time and space and distance. But we can't do that. We're a market economy. We can't just force people into those things. So we have to design and invest in our infrastructure, which shapes our cities in a way that attracts people. And so I found this during the research. This is from the 1912 City Plan of St. Louis, and Mayor Brainerd had sort of alluded to this in his talk, is that the art and science of urban design is to maximize the value of the private use of land, right? Highest and best use, that notion. And it's not just about profit motive, but profit is important, or otherwise you're not going to attract investment and you're not going to build a city. But what's more important is driving that tax base so we can actually sustain ourselves. Now let's start looking at that in terms of the city. Do you see any patterns? This is downtown Dallas. The blue in the center is sort of the Main Street area that's working. The red is unproductive land. It's surface parking lots. It's vacant land, whatnot. The orange is tax exempt. And so we put all the tax exempt stuff around that perimeter where land was cheap because we've already depressed the value. And I have no graphics on here because I wanted to stick with you as much as it did with me. The 2010 downtown plan said, the inner highway loop is a problem, but there's nothing we can do about it. Now, I may not be originally Texan, but I've got enough Texan in me now from being there that we don't ask for permission, we ask for forgiveness. And so this inspired us. I was with a friend who's a developer, and we were having a beer complaining about this. And say, why self-edit ourselves? Why don't we be aspirational and say, what do we want the future of our city to be? And so we put that idea to practice. We drew a boundary around Highway 345 and all of its depressed value, essentially, around it. Calculated all of the tax base in the area and the private wealth. It was only worth about $20 million in private improvements. It was only contributing about $3.5 million in property taxes to the city. That's 245 acres. That's less than a typical suburban single-family home per acre. We said, okay, well, what if we just hypothetically said this is now going to be a place to go to, not through? And that's originally how the highway was when the original Central Expressway was. It scaled down to a surface street through the area. So we said, okay, let's take this 245 acres, put the appropriate amount of parks and private development sites, and we found that we could leverage within 15 years more than $4 billion in private investment, which would equate to more than $100 million a year in property tax revenue. That's something we can borrow against. We're a city staring down the barrel of municipal bankruptcy right now. To me, $110 million a year sounds pretty good. And the point is to go from streets that look like this, like the one I walked under every single day, to go to streets like this, to go to a park like this with the world's saddest bench, to go to parks like this, and you saw Campus Martius earlier, and that is all Campus Martius. But that doesn't answer the question that everybody's thinking right now. Where does the traffic go? Well, since we're all friends here, the answer is who cares? But really, do we actually want 160,000 cars going by and sitting in a parking lot, essentially, with their engines running every single day for 8 hours a day? Well, so during the research, I found this article from San Francisco when they decided to decommission the central artery that had been damaged in the '89 earthquake. And the engineers at the time were using all sort of these scare language that it's going to be grim if you shut this down and don't rebuild it, serious and gridlock and all these terrible words. Well, they couldn't figure out why traffic actually got better when they closed it. The point is people adapt. Trips adapt. And if that doesn't sell it to you, then we looked at the actual street grid, right? So when I started proposing this, the local NBC affiliate said, come out there and let's do an interview. It was 1:30 in the afternoon on a regular day. We're underneath the highway, and it is a parking lot up above. I'm like, this is perfect. Look at that. Now look at this. And we're standing on a 6-lane boulevard, not a single car coming by. We actually weren't using the streets the way they were meant to be used. And so we've got, TxDOT will say we've got 140,000 cars, but we need to plan for 200,000 because that's what they've put in their model for 2040. Well, what if we just said, okay, truck traffic needs to go around the city. Truck traffic doesn't need to be stuck in congestion anyway. So that actually takes us down to about 110,000 cars per day that we've got to handle. And if we actually added up all these numbers of the actual traffic on our city street grid, improved the north-south connections of the street grid that the highway actually disconnects, we have 160,000 cars we could handle just on the street grid, which would be moving slower. Well, actually, they'd probably be moving faster than the 5 miles per hour on average that they're moving now. But it would provide visibility to new businesses, right? New investment and whatnot. And so long story short, TxDOT eventually did show up. And we did that highway because they weren't talking about it at the time. But it was year 39 on a year 40 lifespan. And they showed up with 9 options. And I brought a bunch of people out to where the public event was, and it was actually like 10 miles away from the actual site, but forget that. But those 9 options were just 9 different price tags to rebuild it exactly as it was. We said, those aren't options. So we launched our website, anewdallas.com, and we ended up getting 22,000 hits on the first day. The boss over TxDOT, one of the governor-appointed positions of the Texas Transportation Committee, he saw that, and he said, you know what, you're right. Those are not real options, and the public process is broken. And so he commissioned this study called City Map, which looked at all the highways in downtown, and it looked at 3 options for the highway. Just a modified version that reduced some of the ramps, a sunken version, and if we took it away completely, what would it mean? Not only that, but for the first of its kind of any state DOT that I know, they weren't just looking at traffic, they were looking at the impact beyond their boundaries. They looked at economic development for each, as we were suggesting, and they looked at quality of life impact and the walkability, multimodalism, and all that. And guess what? The surface street option, where we took it down to boulevards, does not perform any worse in terms of traffic, and by far does better in terms of economic development. No surprise there. That's the only reason why we did this. So to sort of jump to the end, here's some lessons learned, but the most important one is that we can design and engineer any kind of city that we want. That should not be the prevailing question. The prevailing question is always about politics and economics. What do we want? What can we afford? What actually generates the most amount of wealth for the most amount of people, and opportunity and choice? And so with that, I would encourage you to see our website, anewdallas.com, where we put all the research. And part of that political notion is that this has ended up growing into a political action committee. And it's the largest super PAC in the state of Texas. We don't have clients that are donors. Our client is the city and its citizens, and we're all about bringing best practices to Dallas. So with that, thank you.
Let's thank Marcus Westbury and Patrick Kennedy for sharing with us their insights.